Well, I'm glad you folks are back. I must say, Roger, that you and Sean, I think that's the best seminar I've ever attended on liturgy. People always ask me what the church of the future is going to look like, as if I or anybody else could tell them. And Roger's exactly right. It's evolving. And you can see where you've come from, but nobody can really tell you where you're going. And the analogy I use to help people understand that is that the Christian church in the 2nd century lived under persecution and in the catacombs. And no one in their wildest imagination could have envisioned the 13th century, where they dominated the life of the whole society, with great cathedrals on every hill in Europe. And yet the people in the 13th century looked back and they saw that their ancestors were the catacomb Christians of the 2nd century. The catacomb Christians of the 2nd century could never have envisioned the cathedrals of the 13th century. So we take a step at a time. And the step you take today will determine your opportunity to take a step in a different direction tomorrow, but you can't jump ahead 25, 50 years and say, this is what we will be, and therefore start becoming that. It's a slow, arduous process. I resonate with the things you say about having to, I love the analogy, you can't see a chain of mountains if you don't stand on one of them. I really treasure my Christian identity. I redefine it all the time, but I don't want to ever lose it. And I must say, I really do enjoy being a member of my parish church in Morristown, New Jersey. We're not there much because I'm at places like this. But when I am there, we are there, and I mean we're there in more than just spirit, and we're deeply involved. Christine actually has been elected to the vestry. We're very close to our rector. I teach their adult class 5 or 6 Sundays a year when I happen to be in town, and so I'm very much a part of that congregation. And we have a tremendous sense of community. And I think that's another thing that you mentioned. We belong to a community. And there are times when everybody needs a community. Let me tell you very briefly about one family in our church. They moved from Atlanta to Morristown a long time ago. They came with 2 little children. One was a 4-month-old babe in arms, and the other was a 4-year-old precious little girl with pigtails. I remember it was a Sunday in August, and I was sitting in the church because I wasn't anywhere else confirming. And so I happened to be sitting behind these people, and so I introduced myself to them and welcomed them to St. Peter's. I wasn't wearing anything other than my necktie. They had no idea I was the bishop of the diocese. And that was my first meeting with them, and I became very close to this family over the years, and I watched these little girls grow. They were spectacular girls. They were leaders in everything. They were in the choir and the youth group. They were stars in high school. They were on the basketball team, the tennis team. They had artistic talent. One of them, the oldest one, graduated and went from high school and went to Vanderbilt. Trained as a public school teacher, got a job in Washington, the state of Washington, teaching public school, and when she was 25 years old, she was mountain climbing. Her ropes broke and she fell 465 feet to her immediate death. That family was devastated. And her little sister, who was 4 years younger, was probably the most devastated. Well, as time goes on, this younger sister finishes high school, enrolls in Vanderbilt. She's much more artistically oriented, so she begins to go to London to study art. But she got a degree from Vanderbilt. She had a significant boyfriend who was from India. She went out to visit him. They were swimming in a beach off the coast of India, and she was eaten by a crocodile. The last child of this family. This family was at the heart of our church. They were in every activity. They were leaders in every capacity. And when our rector heard that this second child had been killed in this tragic way, she didn't know what to do, as nobody knows quite what to do. And she sent out a blast on email to the members of the church to tell them the news. And this is not a little church. We've got 800 or 900 members. And she said, I will be in the church this afternoon at 6 o'clock. If anyone would like to come and be with me, I'll say a few prayers and we can be together. 200 members of that church turned out at 6 o'clock so that we could grieve together. And I don't know how that family made it, but I'm quite sure they couldn't have made it if they hadn't been part of this incredible community. So I think there's some activities in church life that are very, very important. One other personal privilege. This person in this audience named Mary Fagan. Do you say Fagan or Fegan, Mary? Fagan. Stand up, Mary. She writes children's books from a theologically progressive point of view. This is one of them. She's also written one, and I don't remember the exact title, but the substance is God Understood After the Analogy of a rather large, bosomy, hugging grandmother. Oh, Grandmother God, she called it. And it really did change the nature of the way children's religious studies. I think she's from a nun. She's a gifted lady. I just wanted you to know that she exists, and she lives in St. Louis, and she's here. The hospitality of this community to us has been wonderful. You've only failed in one degree, and that is the Boston Red Sox defeated the Yankees, God's favorite team, last night. God must have been taking a nap. It's the only way I can explain it. Boston has just traded away every player on their team that's worth anything, and they still beat the Yankees. It's just amazing to me. But other than that, your hospitality has been wonderful, and you've provided and you have a chance to redeem yourself this afternoon when they're playing the second game of this series. I want to turn in this session to a deeper analysis of the characters that populate the pages of the Gospel of John. I think they hold the key to understanding that book. I've already mentioned them briefly. I'd like now to go into them a bit more substantially. There's something very strange and very unusual about the characters that appear in the fourth Gospel. Recall that this book is written 65 to 70 years after the crucifixion. 3 generations, 3.5 generations. And yet most of the characters that appear in John's Gospel have never been mentioned before by anybody in any Christian source. Almost every other book of the New Testament has been written by this time. But these characters have never been mentioned. And they're not as if they're insignificant minor characters in the drama. These characters are at the center of the Jesus movement. John says that 2 of them are members of the 12, but no other gospel has ever heard of them before. They don't appear in any list. Wonder how the others missed these 2. Where did they come from? Did John know something that nobody else knew? If they were really members of the 12, maybe they were really 14. Or maybe a couple of them had a double identity. Sometimes that's the way we solve our mathematical inconsistencies. Where were they hiding when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written? More than that, John says that these 2 members of the 12 are the bookend figures through which he organizes his gospel. The first one of these yet unknown members of the 12 is introduced in a very elaborate way in chapter 1, and the other shows up and dominates the last week of Jesus' life. They're bookend figures. So I want to begin by analyzing these 2 enigmatic figures more substantially. The first one is a man named Nathanael. It's a name that's never appeared before in any Christian source that we know of. The name itself means the gift of God, just like John means beloved one. Is that a clue? Well, I don't know. He not only starts the gospel, John gets through the prologue and immediately goes into the call of Nathanael. It's clearly important in his scheme of things. And Nathanael receives his call into discipleship directly from Jesus. You can hardly be more direct than that. He appears to be a character who is parallel to Peter. Let me tell you what I mean by that. John's gospel opens with two disciples of John the Baptist turning from John the Baptist to begin to follow Jesus. But only one of them is identified. His name is Andrew. And we're told that Andrew immediately goes and gets his brother, whose name is Simon, and brings Simon to Jesus. And Simon receives his nickname immediately. He hadn't done anything. He becomes the rock. The rock in Aramaic is Cephas or Kepha. The rock in Greek is Petra. So we call Simon Peter, translation of rock. There's nothing about Peter's life that looks very rock-like for a long period of time. Peter is a work in process. But Andrew is the first disciple called with this second anonymous figure, and Andrew then goes and gets his brother Peter, and the first pillar of the Christian movement is set in the first chapter of John's Gospel. And then John says, Philip, who may have been the other disciple. Philip goes to a man named Nathanael. And he says, we have found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. Nathanael is a reluctant convert. Nathanael says, Jesus of Nazareth? Nothing good can come out of Nazareth. That's like folks here in Missouri say nothing good can come out of Kansas, or nothing here can come out of Oklahoma, or whatever you happen to look down on. Nothing good could come out of Nazareth. And Philip says, well, you come and see. And so Nathanael and Philip come to where Jesus is, and while they're still coming, Jesus says of Nathanael, behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile. Well, that blows Nathanael's mind. He says, how do you know me? And Jesus says, and this indicates that John thinks he's clairvoyant, Jesus says, before I called you, I saw you under the fig tree. And Nathanael is still blown. And he says, well, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. That's a pretty quick conversion. Now you need to know, you Gentiles, that to say he was under the fig tree, that's the traditional place where rabbis study Torah. Every Jew would have known that. And so Jesus and Nathanael have this interesting conversation. And after Nathanael makes this robust kind of confession of faith, Jesus is the one that's startled. And he says, because I said I saw you under the fig tree, you now believe? And then he says, you're gonna see a lot greater things than that. You're going to see the heavens opened. And you're going to see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Well, again, if you were Jewish, you would know that that story comes out of the 28th chapter of the book of Genesis, where Jacob had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a ladder connecting heaven and earth, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on that ladder which kept God and human life together. John has taken that ladder away and turned it into Jesus. Jesus is now the link between God and human life. And the angels of God are descending and ascending on this connector. Now, that's a pretty dramatic way to open your gospel for a person that you've never heard of before, that nobody in the Christian tradition has ever heard of before. And so you immediately have to raise the question, who is Nathanael? Is he a legendary character? Is he a symbolic character? And if he's a symbol, what is he a symbol of? Or who is he a symbol for? So keep this description of Nathanael in your mind for just a moment and ask yourself if that description reminds you of anybody else who was a major player in the early Christian story. An Israelite in whom there is no guile, who wrote in one of his epistles, I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I was advanced in the study of the law beyond all of my peers. Before the demands of the law, I was blameless. Paul wrote that. Who was a constant student of the Torah, zealous for the protection of the Torah? Paul. Who was the counterpoint to Peter in the early Christian church? It was Paul. One author has written a book called A Tale of Two Missions, where he places the Paul mission and the Peter mission in the early church in tension against each other. Who was a reluctant convert? It's Paul. He almost had to be dragged into the Christian faith. And who was it who would see the heavens opened so they could see Jesus as the connector between God and human life? That's Paul. Jesus has become the ladder in John's opening story. God and human life find unity in the person of Jesus. Paul is the first one to say, God was in Christ, reconciling. Paul also considered himself one of the apostles, not one of the 12, but he argued that his apostleship was as valid as any one of the 12. Do you suppose that John is opening his gospel by tipping his hand to Paul in chapter 1? Paul, who moved with zeal, first to persecute and then to carry the mission. If you read Paul in the order that Paul wrote, 1 Thessalonians 1st, Galatians 2nd, 1st and 2nd Corinthians 3rd, Romans 4th, Philemon 5th, and Philippians 6, you find that Paul is turning away from his moralistic views more and more into mystical views. It's in Philippians that he has what we call the kenosis passage of the self-emptying God, moving in the mystical direction that I think John is also moving. Is Nathanael a symbol for a man named Paul, who was one of the twin pillars of the Christian movement? Well, I didn't come up with that idea, but I'm persuaded by it. I got it from a Canadian scholar named E.F. Scott, whose book was written in 1907. Sometimes we moderns disparage people because they wrote long ago. Some of the scholarship of the 19th and early 20th century was absolutely remarkable, and E.F. Scott seems to be one of them. And as I studied the characters in John's gospel, I became convinced that they are all more symbolic than they are historical, and that John gives us clues all the way through his gospel that this is an interpretive portrait built around symbolic figures, and you've got to understand the clue. And the way you get to the clue is not to read it literally. So my first conclusion is that this first of the twin towers of John's Gospel, the bookend figures, members of the 12, but never heard of before, is a symbolic figure that represents that part of the Christian community that came into its existence as the followers of Paul. So let's look at the other bookend figure. He is a nameless disciple. He never gets a name. He is only called the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's commonly referred to as the beloved disciple. Once again, there's no mention of such a person who is especially beloved of Jesus in any of the other Gospels. This is a Johannine character. So let me trace his presence in the fourth Gospel and lift it out of the text for you. He enters the story in chapter 13. Now, if you understand the outline of John's Gospel, and I haven't got time to go into it except in the briefest of way, there's the prologue, in the beginning was the Word, then there's the story of Nathanael, and then in chapter 2 through chapter 11, he moves into the 7 signs, the book of signs. Then in chapter 12, he pivots and begins to face toward the crucifixion. In chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16, Jesus gives the farewell discourses, long, convoluted monologues. That's where most of our funeral material comes from, those farewell discourses. In chapter 17, he has Jesus give the high priestly prayer, which is very different from "let this cup pass from me." In chapters 18 and 19, he tells us the story of the Passion. In chapter 20, he gives us the resurrection and the conclusion, and then there's the epilogue in chapter 21. That's the order. The beloved disciple comes right after chapter 12, which is the pivot, and it begins to look toward the final things. When he appears in the story for the first time, he's in the most intimate position with Jesus. He's never been heard of before, but he shows up in chapter 13 at the Last Supper, seated by Jesus, leaning on his breast. That's what the text says. And the interesting thing is that Peter can't get to Jesus without going through the beloved disciple. Jesus says, "One of you are going to betray me." And Peter says, "Ask him who it is." Peter doesn't have direct access. The beloved disciple has direct access. Peter has to go through the beloved disciple. The next time the beloved disciple is seen is after Jesus has been arrested. And Peter and the beloved disciple want to follow the events of the arrest, and so they try to get into the courtyard of the high priest. And the beloved disciple seems to be well connected. He seems to have people that he knows inside the high priest's family, so he gets in without any trouble. But Peter can't get in without the beloved disciple opening the door for him. There's a strange, interesting relationship between Peter and the beloved disciple. Peter always sort of runs second. The next time the beloved disciple appears is in chapter 20. Well, that's not quite right. He appears in chapter 19. And he appears in chapter 19 as the only disciple who has gone all the way to the cross with Jesus. The rest of them are not there. Only the beloved disciple. And interestingly enough, he's paired at the foot of the cross with the mother of Jesus. They're the only people there in the fourth gospel. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The next time the beloved disciple appears in the fourth gospel is in chapter 20, and that's the resurrection chapter. Mary Magdalene has discovered the emptiness of the tomb, and she runs to the disciples to give them this message. And two of the disciples come to investigate. Guess who they are? Peter and the beloved disciple. And they both run, but the beloved disciple always gets there first. He stops at the edge of the tomb, and he peers in, and he sees the clothes lying in order, the headcloth where the head should be, the cloth binding the feet where the feet should be. But he waits. And then Peter, who finally catches up and who has no reticence about him, busts into the tomb, and he sees the same thing the beloved disciple sees. But the text tells us that the beloved disciple believed. And Peter, he keeps on struggling. It's an interesting story, an interesting relationship, an interesting dynamic between the beloved disciple and Peter. Now, who do you suppose this anonymous beloved disciple actually is? Is he a person? There have been many theories offered throughout Christian history as to his identity. The most popular early one that existed from about the 2nd century to about the 19th century was that this was John, the son of Zebedee. I don't know of a single scholar, Johannine scholar in the world today, who would accept that designation at this point. But that was the long-time favorite of the Christian church. But other candidates have come forward. I read one 400-page book proving that the beloved disciple was really Thomas. Another one tries to prove that the beloved disciple is James, the brother of Jesus. Another suggests that it was not a man at all, but Mary Magdalene, about whom there was a lot of connection. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which I think is a 3rd century piece of literature, Peter complains because Jesus seems to love Magdalene more than any of the other disciples. Peter says, why, he even kisses her on the lips. That's the 3rd century. Your fantasies can take off after a couple of centuries. Another possibility that people have advanced rather seriously is that the beloved disciple was really Lazarus, raised from the dead. Well, it's hard to believe that story is literal, so it's hard to believe that Lazarus is literal. But I'll tell you in just a moment why I think that development came. So who is he? What is John drawing when he draws the portrait of the beloved disciple? Is he like Nathanael, a symbol? Is he not really a person? If he's a symbol, what is he a symbol of? Of what is he a symbol? He's portrayed as the closest of all to Jesus. He's portrayed as the only one of the 12 willing to go to the cross with him. He's portrayed as the first to see. He's portrayed as the first to believe. I think he's a symbol of John's understanding of what an ideal follower of Jesus would be. But I didn't come up with that by myself. A man named Rudolf Bultmann, whom I regard as the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century, a German scholar who taught at the University of Marburg for most of his career. Bultmann says in his magnificent commentary that only if you see him not as a person but as a symbol will you ever understand the fourth gospel. And I think Bultmann is dead right. So it appears that John opens his gospel and closes his gospel with two bookend figures of great significance, both of whom he considers members of the 12. But one is a symbol for Peter and that wing of the church, and the other is a symbol for the true disciple. So keep that in mind. Then other characters who appear in John's Gospel but nowhere else become suspicious because they too must be symbols. And some of them are very popular figures. Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman by the well, the man who was crippled for 38 years, the man who was born blind, and Lazarus who was raised from the dead even with his flesh already decaying. Am I suggesting that all of these are literary figures, symbolic figures that John has created, around which he weaves his interpretive portrait of Jesus? I'm absolutely convinced that that is the case, that every one of them is a literary creation, not a person of history. And it is the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead that clinches this case for me. Let me tell you why. First of all, he has been dead for 4 days before Jesus arrives. Secondly, he is buried and bound in his grave cloths, binding his arms to his side and his feet together. Thirdly, he has been in his grave for 4 days. The text reveals that his flesh is already decaying, and Jesus comes to Bethany while the mourners are still present. Some of the mourners are absolute critics of Jesus, not friends, critics. So it's this mixed crowd, and Jesus comes and he leads a procession out to the cave where the body of Lazarus has been buried. It is a very public event. It's not a private little event. This is not going into the room and raising the child's hand that's thought to be dead with everybody outside mourning and saying, "Tabitha, arise," and the child arises, but nobody sees it. This is a public event, not just friends, but foes of Jesus. It's a rather incredible scene. And Jesus goes to the cave and says, "Roll back the stone." That's when Martha says, "No, no, Lord, it's 4 days already, he stinketh." But they obey. They roll back the stone. And Jesus says, "Lazarus, come forth." And here comes Lazarus bound in his grave clothes, walking in baby steps because his legs are bound together. He comes out of the grave, 4 days dead, already decaying. Is this history? And Jesus says, "Unbind him and let him go." Now, do you think that happened in a public event and nobody wrote about it for 65 to 70 years? Is that not incredulous? Are you not trying to put a literal blinder on anybody that would read that gospel if you pretend that's a literal story? But I think the clue to the identity of the beloved disciple is in the figure of Lazarus. And it's that clue that helps me to see that the beloved disciple is also a symbol. Are you aware that the only person in the entire fourth gospel who is said by anyone to be the special object of Jesus' love is Lazarus in the 11th chapter? When Martha sends a message to Jesus about Lazarus' sickness, the message says, "Master, him whom thou lovest is ill." Is that a clue? Next, the narrative in John's Gospel says, "Now Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus." For those of you who work crossword puzzles, you know that the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. That's out of the Lazarus story. He weeps at the grave of Lazarus, and the crowd says, "See how he loved him." The only place in the Bible where anybody is described as the especially beloved one of Jesus is in the story of Lazarus, which is clearly not a story of history. But what was unique about Lazarus was that Lazarus was the one who could see beyond all limits, who could get outside all literal boxes, because Lazarus could see even beyond the limits of life. Now let me tell you the other reason why I'm convinced that this story is not literal. The first thing you do in Bible study, to me, is that you look and see if there is anything in the Hebrew tradition upon which this story has been built. I suggested this morning that the story of the ascension of Elijah in 2 Kings chapter 2 is the place from which Luke got his analogy by which he told the story of Jesus' ascension. I won't bore you with the details, but Elijah ascends into heaven but needs a little help. He needs a magical fiery chariot drawn by magical fiery horses. And he needs a whirlwind to come and propel him heavenward, because even the ancients knew you couldn't defy gravity. They might not have understood gravity, but they knew you couldn't defy it. And right before Elijah ascends into heaven, he has a conversation with his successor, Elisha. I do wish they had had a little bit different names. They're very confused. I wish one was called Joe and one was called Tom, but that just isn't very biblical. So Elisha and Elijah are having this conversation, and Elisha says to Elijah, "Master, I have a final deathbed request to make of you." And Elisha says, "What is it, my son?" And Elisha says, "I could not do the work you have asked me to do. I could not become your successor unless you're willing to grant me a double portion of your spirit." And Elijah says, "I do not know if I have the power to give that to you. But if you see me ascending into the sky, then you will know that your request has been granted." And that was the moment, according to this ancient narrative, when the magical fiery chariot came out of the sky, drawn by magical fiery horses, and swooped down and stopped exactly where Elijah and Elisha were standing, just like it's a regular stop on a regular bus route. And Elijah hops on board, waves goodbye, the whirlwind comes, and the magical horses pull that magical chariot, propelled by that whirlwind, up into heaven, and Elisha sees. And so he knows that he is going to be granted a double portion of Elijah's enormous but still human spirit. And Luke takes that story and he magnifies it. The new and greater Elijah can ascend without the help of a fiery chariot and fiery horses. The new and greater Elijah does not need to be propelled by a whirlwind. And the new and greater Elijah does not just give a double portion of his human spirit to his single disciple. He gives the infinite power of God's Holy Spirit poured out on all generations. It's Elijah magnified. And just so you'll know where Luke gets the story, he takes the fire off that chariot and those horses, and he turns it into the tongues of fire that dance on their heads at Pentecost. And he takes that whirlwind and he turns it into the mighty rushing wind that filled the upper room. And the Spirit of God flows out on all the nations, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and dwellers in Mesopotamia, the whole world. It's an Elijah story magnified. It's not a literal story of Jesus defying gravity. Carl Sagan, before he died, and I may have said this the last time I was here, but that's all right, you've forgotten it. Carl Sagan, before he died, became a friend of mine. We did a couple of conferences together. And he was an incredible human being, incredible mind. I loved seeing him in the film last night. He was an atheist by his religious profession. He was a Jew by his ethnic background. But he was a strange kind of atheist. He was what I call a God-intoxicated atheist. He talked about God more than I did. I find frequently that atheists love to talk about the God in whom they do not believe. And he also loved to puncture the pious pomposity of unthinking religious people. So at this conference, I think it was in 1996 in Washington, D.C., he saw me and he came bounding across the room and he said, "Jack, have you ever thought of what the ascension of Jesus looks like to an astrophysicist?" And I said, "No, Carl, I haven't thought about that, but I was sure I was going to have to." And if you remember him, he talked with his hands. He said, "Do you know that if Jesus literally ascended into the sky, and even if he traveled at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, he hasn't yet escaped our galaxy?" Well, Carl Sagan is living in a physical world that he understands literally. But Luke was not writing in that kind of world. Luke was writing an interpretive narrative that was never meant to be literalized. And so you don't have to worry about astrophysics. It was an Elijah story magnified. But for our purposes today, the important clue is that only in the Lazarus story is there any indication that there was a person who was especially beloved of Jesus, and that's in John's Gospel, and I think they fill in each other. So the first thing you do to try to make sense out of the Lazarus story is to look in the Old Testament, see if you can find any parallel that's been magnified. That happens over and over again. But I could find none. So I turned to the only other place I knew how to turn. I turned to the only other mention of a person named Lazarus in the entire New Testament. And that's in the Gospel of Luke. And it's in a parable. Clearly a parable, not history, a parable. And in that parable, Lazarus is a beggar with sores all over his arms and face, begging at the gate of a wealthy man whom we have given the name Dives, which simply means a wealthy man. So it's the parable of Lazarus and the wealthy man. And the wealthy man, as is symptomatic, I think, of great wealth, the wealthy man never sees the humble beggar. Just doesn't see him. Just invisible. And in the parable, they both die, both Lazarus and the rich man. And they go to two different places. Lazarus goes to a Jewish image of heaven. It's described as going to the bosom of Abraham. Interesting analogy. I think if I were going to spend eternity in anybody's bosom, I would prefer it not to be Abraham's. But that's another story. This is an image of fulfillment and heaven. Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. And Dives, the rich man, is in a place of torment. But they seem to be able to communicate in this parable. So Dives says to Abraham, "Father Abraham, it's very hot down here. Why don't you send Lazarus down so that he can dip his finger into water and quench my thirst?" Dives still sees Lazarus as his servant. And Abraham says, "I'm very sorry, Dives, but you just can't get there from here." So Dives tries a second strategy. He says, "Well then, Father Abraham, if Lazarus can't relieve my suffering, how about sending him back to the world so he can warn my brothers, lest they too come to this place of torment?" And in the parable, Abraham says, "Dives, your brothers have Moses and the prophets. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not listen even if one is raised from the dead." That's Luke's parable. John turns that parable into a quasi-historical event to confirm the analysis of the parable. One is quite literally raised back into this life from the dead, and it does not create belief. Indeed, in John's Gospel, that's the episode that causes the disciples, or causes the enemies of Jesus, to institute the proceedings that will lead to the crucifixion. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the thing that leads to the crucifixion is the cleansing of the temple. John puts the cleansing of the temple in chapter 2 at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And he uses the raising of Lazarus as the event that sets in motion the activities that will lead to the cross. That's where John got that story. And he never intended it to be understood literally. It's a parable that he turned into quasi-history. Now hold all of that, if you can, in your mind for just a moment. And let me look at another set of John's characters until we can bring them together. And those are the characters in the Johannine material who have been mentioned before in some other place, usually in one of the other Gospels. And so these are characters who appear to have been people of history. But in John, they are given personalities that they've never had before. He's even done a makeover on all of them. And among these people are Thomas. He's just a name on a list in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He becomes Doubting Thomas and plays a starring role in the resurrection in John. There's Philip and Andrew, the two disciples that have Greek names. And there's stories about both of them, nothing about them in any of the other Gospels. But they become significant players in John's Gospel. And then there's Pilate. Pilate was clearly a person of history. But the Pilate we meet in the fourth Gospel has a very long one-on-one dialogue with Jesus of Nazareth. Very different from anywhere else. But the one I want to look at in depth is the one that John calls the mother of Jesus. Never Mary, she's the mother of Jesus. And John develops the mother of Jesus in two stories. Never a birth story. There's no birth story in John. So the mother of Jesus stars in two stories. One, we've already mentioned, is the story of turning water into wine. They're at a wedding feast. They're in a holy place. Giant bottles of water for the Jewish rites of purification, each containing 30 gallons, are in this worship space. They run out of wine at the wedding feast. That's a social disgrace. They come to the mother of Jesus. That means she's playing the role of the mother of the groom. And they ask her to fix the shortage of wine problem. And she goes to Jesus, and she tries to force him to act, and he resists her. My hour has not yet come. I cannot do it until the proper moment is here. The moment is not here. What have I got to do with you, woman? My hour has not yet come. And yet, even though that's his response, she goes and tells the servants to do whatever he says. And they fill the water pots. And then they draw from these water pots and take to the steward, the wine steward. And he tastes the wine, and it's better than any wine they've ever had before. The mother of Jesus stands at the juxtaposition of Judaism and Christianity. As the mother of Jesus, she stands for Judaism giving birth to Christianity. And that seems to be the message in that first of the book of signs. And there's only one other story in the fourth gospel that mentions the mother of Jesus, and that takes place at the foot of the cross. But before I get to that, let me say that the family of Jesus continues to play that same role as the mother of Jesus. By the time you get to the 7th chapter, the festival of the Jews, the harvest festival, the Thanksgiving day called Sukkot, or tabernacles or booths, has come. And the brothers try to force Jesus to go up to Jerusalem at this festival and declare himself. And he rebukes them just the way he rebuked his mother. His time is not right. You cannot force the coming of the kingdom. And so he refuses to go. His brothers go up. And then Jesus goes up secretly after his brothers have departed, but never in response to pressure. So Jesus' mother and Jesus' brothers seem to be representatives of a Judaism that tries to force Jesus before he's ready. They stand in the tradition somewhere between Judaism and Christianity. The waters of Jewish purification get transformed into the wine of the Christian Eucharist, and Mary is at the transition place. If the mother of Jesus is also a symbol, as I believe she is in this gospel, is it not reasonable to think of her as a symbol of Judaism itself, the mother of Christianity? And if the beloved disciple is a symbol of the ideal Christian, the ideal disciple, the one who understands, the one who can see beyond all the limits, is it not of interest that John brings these two symbolic figures to the foot of the cross? Now be aware that the mother of Jesus has never gone to the cross in Mark or Matthew or Luke. She's a very minor figure in those Gospels. But she is at the foot of the cross only in the fourth Gospel. Now I know that'd be quite upsetting to some of the great artists of the centuries who have portrayed the mother of Jesus grieving, holding the deceased body of her son in her arms at the foot of the cross, accompanied by the beloved disciple. But that's a late developing addition to the Christian story. She does not go to the cross until 65 to 70 years after the crucifixion. It would also upset Mel Gibson, because he really is not a very good biblical scholar. So here you have, at the foot of the cross, two of John's premier symbols. The mother of Jesus, the symbol of Judaism. The beloved disciple, the symbol of the new kind of disciple. The faithful one, the one who will go all the way, the one who understands, the one who sees beyond the limits, the one who sees beyond death. And John has Jesus from the cross speak to these two symbolic figures. To his mother, the symbol of Judaism, he says, "Woman, behold your son." You created this Christian movement. You are its mother. Behold your own creation. Do not deny it. And then he turns to the beloved disciple. And he says to the symbol of the Christian movement, Judaism is your mother. Own your history. Do not spit upon your mother. That becomes a powerful story. And this becomes a powerful gospel, capable of overcoming every boundary, including the boundary between Jew and Christian. This gospel was never meant to be read literally. That is not in John's purpose at all. I am not disturbing the true believers, as my friend from the Australian Broadcasting Company suggested. I am discovering John's hidden truth that has been hidden from us for far too long. So John wrote his interpretation of Jesus 65 to 70 years after Jesus' death, and he invites us to come into the experience, not to literalize it, but to understand it, to touch it, to be embraced by it, to be transformed. What I will do tomorrow in the service, and inevitably more brief or briefer than I can do here, is to look at the cross and to see what John means by the cross, to see why it is that he calls the cross my hour, to see why it is that he says, when I am lifted up on the cross, then people will know who God is. John would be horrified at the idea that somebody would read his gospel literally. He is calling us into the Jesus experience, a deep and mystical experience of entering into the life of that which is holy. This gospel, which I once disparaged because I did not know how to read it, is now the doorway into the deepest kind of Christian life that I've ever been able to talk about. So I hope that fills you with something to think about. Thank you very much. Let me take off my coat to reveal the ecclesiastical power that I possess.
Looks good on you.
It's only about 2 inches too big, but that's okay.
Well, it's not supposed to have a tie.
Last time he gave me one, it was size 19. This one's only 16 and a half, so we're making progress. I'm now happy to entertain questions, comments. In order, ladies first, and you don't get my attention, you got to get his attention. I have no power.
I am currently employed by the traditional institution of the Episcopal Church, and my responsibility is youth and children ministry. And I grew up in the Episcopal Church with many of the stories traditionally taught, with the confines and the restrictiveness of it, and realized that that's a danger to continue to do that. But I stay because I'm looking for other ways to do that. It is very hard. I mean, I embrace it, love, and have followed you since you started publishing. Thank you very much. But my question is, these are very expansive concepts and evolved concepts in a world where I'm not in touch with or aware of resources of how we can talk to families who have children, because it was very easy to teach the traditional stories. It's very box-like. I mean, they're very there. Do you have resources or thoughts on what we do with our young families with children?
I don't really, but the organization that publishes my column once a week has developed some children's church school materials that are designed to bring them into the mystery instead of clobbering them with literalness. And what do they call that, Chris?
Joyful Path.
The Joyful Path, thank you. Usually Chris is my Wikipedia in place, but I'm happy to have more than one Wikipedia.
We're all behind you, Bishop
I think they've done
Spong.
a good job. I think Mary Fagan, writing children's books, also understands and does a good job. So I commend those resources to you.
If I may add about that, there are 2 semesters or 2 series on Joyful Path out now, and the second one is actually much better than the first, but the emphasis has been to teach behaviors over beliefs. So it's the orthopraxy over orthodoxy, and it can be ordered directly from progressivechristianity.org. And it is admirably good literature. Both of them are good, but I think the second one much better than the first.
Well, I have no idea who wrote them, but my sense is that it's sort of like your first child. You ought to raise them till they're 21, throw them away, and then start over. By that time, you know how to raise your second child. I think the same thing is true with Living the Questions. I think the longer they've been in the business, the better they've gotten.
Yeah, I agree.
But
Which is, again, for teenagers, late teens, the Living the Questions series is in several iterations, but also very useful, especially for short attention span adults and kids, because they do very brief vignettes of major scholars. But it's a great
Living the
resource.
Questions is written by 2 Methodist ministers in Arizona who are really terrific young men. But let me go to the real issue, I think, behind your question. Most people are afraid that if they let go a literal view of the Bible, they will have nothing left. So the problem is complicated by the fact that the church has never bothered to educate its lay people. We like to keep them ignorant and childlike because they give us so much less trouble. We like for them to be children. That's why we exhort them all the time to be born again. If you're born again enough times, you never have to grow up. And what we need to do is to allow our people to grow up. And I'm sure that that clergy who do it will have Roger's experience. They'll be sent packing. Because what you're doing is threatening the security of insecure people who don't really believe what they're saying, but they don't have an alternative, and so they're not going to let go. Children get along fine. It's the adults that are the problems. Now, every child goes through a crisis of faith at age 6 or 7 when they suddenly realize that a jolly old elf who lives at the North Pole can't possibly get around to every house in the world on one night. That stretches credibility. And so they come to mother and father and they say, oh, don't tell us that Santa Claus stuff. We know that you're Santa Claus. They're not upset, but mothers and fathers are upset. So mothers and fathers say, well, we just won't have Christmas around here anymore if you don't believe. And the church acts like that. Someone said, I lost my faith in Santa Claus at age 6 and God at age 16 and don't know which one I miss the most. Well, if you've turned God into a kind of adult Santa Claus, I understand that. But if you can allow the concept of God to grow up, to engage you at a very different level. And so those of you who are clergy in this audience, I think you've abdicated your responsibility to educate your congregations. And part of it is that you do it out of fear. Now, I would recommend that you don't do it in the pulpit, because the pulpit is a power position. When you stand behind a pulpit, usually elevated above the congregation, you're tempted to say, thus saith the Lord, and you get yourself and the Lord deeply confused. I suggest you do education in a proper educational setting, in a classroom, where you are a teacher and not an authority, where people can ask questions, where they can process material, where they can challenge and say, I don't agree with that. And you do it Sunday after Sunday, week after week, month after month, year after year, and you repeat yourself over and over again, and after they've heard it 3 or 4 times, they think they originated it. And they'll say, oh, I heard that years ago. That's not troubling to me anymore. And you have some growth. Folks, I never served a church in the liberal part of America. I know what it's like to live in Springfield and Fort Worth and Dallas and places like that. I served a church in the town that made Jerry Falwell famous. Before I was elected bishop, I served as rector of a church that called itself the Cathedral of the Confederacy, that flew the Confederate flag on its flagpole until I became the rector. And when I told them that we were now in a 70% black city and they're likely to have a riot on the front of their church, they decided maybe it's time to take that flag down. We compromised. They put it inside. It became a tourist marker. They put it by the pew that Robert E. Lee sat in when he worshiped there, and he was a regular member, so was Jefferson Davis. It has an interesting history. Richmond has an interesting history. But after the first year, they forgot to put the flag out ever again, so it disappeared. But that's the sort of thing but in that church, that's what I was saying, in that church, I taught a Bible class every Sunday. I did in Lynchburg, I did in Richmond for 7 years, from the 1st of September to the end of May. And I went through everything I'd ever learned in seminary, and I taught them about how the Bible came to be, and it didn't drop out of heaven, fully written, divided into chapters and verses, and in the King James Version. And they absorbed this. And what happened? Oh, we had some people that left. They wanted a quieter harbor. But I felt like there needed to be one church in Richmond and one church in Lynchburg that would offer the possibility for thinking people to engage the Scriptures in an adult way. And for every one we lost, we must have gained 20 more. And the word got out that this was a very different kind of church. And they grew. I think clergy are afraid that if they talk about what they really know, and nothing I'm saying is new, and this stuff has been around forever, at least 200 years, it just hadn't gotten to the pew yet. And so if we could take our congregations into our trust, and I used to announce in that Bible class, I'd start it by saying, now, this class is not for everybody. I only want those people who are willing to think about issues and grapple. And if it's going to upset you, please stay home, because I haven't got time to keep you satisfied. And I would really rather you not come. Well, that made them want to come even more. Who can tell me I'll be upset? I'm a big boy. I'm a big girl. So they came. And I remember in Lynchburg, I decided I was going to do a series on the birth narratives. Now, I announced it in September. I'm going to start on the first Sunday in Advent. Going to go as far beyond Christmas as it takes me to cover the birth narratives. And the anxiety started building. People began to be very apprehensive. He's going to take Christmas away from us. You know, the Santa Claus God is going to die. But when the day came that we started, we had standing room only in that auditorium. They were packed against the walls. And when I finished, people came up to me and said, you know, I never did believe all that stuff anyway, but I thought I had to. You know, stars do not announce human events. If that star in the east announced the birth of Jesus, given the distance we know stars are, it would have had to have been planted a couple of billion years before the right night, so its light would get to the earth at exactly the right moment. That's not reality. There is no such thing as a star that wanders through the sky so slowly that wise men can keep up with it. Everybody knows that, except when they read the Bible. And even the star didn't seem to know the directions. They had to go by the palace of Herod and consult the Jewish scriptures. You know, they're not going to let a natural sign replace the Jewish scriptures. So the star only carried them to Herod's palace, and then they had to consult the book of Micah. And that's when the star reappeared and led them down to Bethlehem. Now, this is not history. But once you tell people what it is, it doesn't disappear. Once children learn that there's no such thing as a literal Santa Claus, Christmas does not disappear. And the call to all of us at Christmas to give to others is part of what makes that such a beautiful holiday. It's a symbolic feast of giving, of getting outside your limits and giving your life and your love away. It's a very powerful day. So instead of killing Christmas, I think we recreated Christmas. Does that mean you can't use the symbols? I have creche scenes out all over my house. We have 3 or 4 of them. The symbols are very important, but they're not literal symbols. They're Jewish storytelling symbols. If you want to know where the wise men come from, go back and read Isaiah 60. If you read Isaiah 60, you'll find that kings shall come to the brightness of God's rising. They come on camels, they come from Sheba, and they bring gold and frankincense. Doesn't that sound just a little bit familiar? But how many people know that's in the Bible? And because you all are good Missouri Baptist, you say, where's the myrrh? And then you go back and you read that story again. It says they come on camels and they come from Sheba. And some good Jewish person says, Sheba? Isn't there another story in our tradition about another royal visitor coming to pay homage to another king of the Jews? So they go back and find the Queen of Sheba story that we all know because they made a movie out of it, not because we've read it. Coming to visit King Solomon. If you read that story, guess what she brought? Truckloads of spices. And the only spice they knew anything about in the Middle East was myrrh. It was a sweet-smelling resin from a bush in the desert. And it was basically Jewish deodorant. That's what it was. They put it in their clothes because they didn't get to take baths very often. Body odors are pretty heavy. So they drowned it out with myrrh. And then they discovered that if you take a deceased body and wrap it in a linen shroud or bind it in cloths and put lots of myrrh in it, that the myrrh will drown out the odors of death until the burial takes place, so it becomes associated with death. And so gold gets associated with kings, and frankincense gets associated with divinity, and myrrh gets associated with death. And so these wise men just happen to have a cache of gold and a cache of frankincense and a cache of myrrh with them in case the Messiah happens to be born somewhere. And so they follow the star so that they can interpret the meaning of this birth. And the most important symbol is that they're not Jews. When Jesus is born, he draws Gentiles and Jews together. It's a universal symbol. That's what the story is about. And when people learn that there's more to the story than just the literal creche scene acts, then it becomes a powerful story. So if we, in our role as clergy, can help educate our people that when the literal story of the Bible is demolished, as it has been demolished by biblical scholarship over the last 200 years, that doesn't mean there is no truth in it. It means that we go to a different level of truth, and it becomes a powerful and transformative story, and we are in the drama. It's not external, we are in the drama. So that's what I think we need to do to make it possible for you to do your work with children in your Sunday school, and thank you for doing it. A gentleman, and thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
I'm curious as to what your thinking is about God's ability to influence the human mind.
To
I've
do
never
what?
heard you comment on that.
To do what?
Influence the human mind.
To influence the human mind. Well, that's a good question, and I thank you for it. But in order to begin to address it, we'd have to go through an elaborate discussion of what we mean by the word God. And if you mean a supernatural being who lives above the clouds, as Roger has been saying, I've always said sky. I guess I like cloudless skies better than clouds. And also I get it confused with Microsoft. If we're in the cloud, then I think you'd answer that very differently. And the same issue comes with prayer. Does God influence human activity? And I don't know how to answer that. My favorite way of clarifying it, not answering it, is to tell you a story about the head of the Episcopal Church in Scotland. His name was Richard Holloway. He's retired now, so I guess the head was. Richard Holloway. He's about 6 feet 4 inches tall and he weighs about 140 pounds. Looks a bit like Ichabod Crane. But he is one of the best minds in the whole Anglican Communion, and he's a very close friend. And he's very rebellious. He's just written an autobiography which is entitled Leaving Alexandria. Isn't that correct? Wasn't that his name? In which he talks about his own faith crisis. This is the head of the Episcopal Church. It's a powerful book. Anyway, Richard was engaging an audience not unlike you, and the lady stood up and said, "Bishop, do you pray?" And Richard said, "No," and didn't say another word. And just let that no sit on that audience for a very uncomfortable amount of time. And they kept trying to process it. This doesn't process. This is a bishop. Bishops are supposed to pray. He says, "I don't pray." That doesn't compute. And after the audience had gotten painfully squirmy, Richard finally broke the silence and he said, "Madam," I don't know whether he said madam or not, but I'll say madam. He said, "Madam," he said, "What?"
I said, "It sounds good."
It sounds good. He said, "Madam, if I'd answered your question yes, you would have assumed that I pray the way you define prayer, and that wouldn't be so. So I can't answer that question with a yes, so I have to give you a no. If you're willing to engage in a long enough conversation so that we can define what you mean by God and what I mean by God, then I might well answer your question in a very different manner." So I think that's the only way I know how to respond to this. It's just beyond the scope of a Q&A period, but it's something that we need to wrestle with. In my column, I receive mail from that column all the time from all over the world, and I receive questions. I would bet that 1 out of 20 of my letters that column elicits are questions about the efficacy of prayer, because I think that's where most people define what they mean by God. It's not theoretical, it's when they pray that they define God. And so you begin to disturb the way they think about God, and they no longer are able to pray. And that's when the crisis comes, and that's when I get the questions. But for what it's worth, defined the way I define it, prayer is a very important part of my life, and I engage in it every day. Do I think that because I pray my will is going to be done on earth as it ought to be? No, that's not my understanding of God. And without boring you with too many stories, let me tell you just one more. My wife, whose name was Joan, to whom I was married for 37 years, died in 1988 of breast cancer. She was diagnosed in 1982, and the doctors told us that it was right advanced by the time they found it. It had become an external draining sore. That's right far along. The doctors had told us that she probably had no more than 2 years to live. And when you're in public life, you can't keep private secrets. So everybody seemed to know of my wife's diagnosis as quickly as I did. And prayer groups were formed. Episcopal prayer groups, Roman Catholic prayer groups, ecumenical prayer groups, all kinds of prayer groups. And people would write us and say, we're praying for your wife. We're praying for you. Now, I appreciated that because they were really saying they cared. They were saying they loved us. And that was comforting. I wasn't alone. But when she didn't die, after 2 years, these prayer groups began to take credit. They said, it's because we're praying that your wife is still living. It was as if there was a gigantic war going on between God and the devil, and people's prayers were helping God beat the devil. It's an interesting concept. And again, I don't want to argue with people. They were expressing their love. But I think about things. So I said to myself, the reason they're praying is that I'm pretty well known in New Jersey. I'm a fairly high-profile public figure. A lot of people know who I am. I was probably the most controversial bishop New Jersey had ever had. So I was in the paper a lot. I was fairly well known. But suppose that a person who was a garbage collector in Newark at that time was the poorest per capita city in America, and a garbage collector is probably the bottom of the social heap in the poorest city in the world. I tried to find the person who would be the least socially prominent. Suppose he had a wife who had cancer, but nobody knew him, so there are no great organized prayer efforts for him. Do I really think that God would allow his wife to live a shorter time than my wife because I was socially prominent and he was not? Do I think that God would allow his wife to die a more painful death than my wife died because I was socially well known and he was not? If I thought God acted that way, I would become an atheist immediately. I can't imagine a God bound by social limits or social status. So what do you do with prayer? I think there's something called energy. I think prayer loosens energy. I think prayer binds people together. I find some interesting studies that plants seem to grow better when people talk to them. I don't know what that's about. Maybe it's just they breathe carbon dioxide on them while they're talking to them. I don't know. But I know that people who are well-loved and well-connected don't get sick as often, seem to get well quicker, go through the life crises, even death, with more equilibrium. So I think there's something that binds the human family together that is beyond our ability to understand, and so we call it God, we call it energy, we call it prayer, but I think it's real. So I don't want to ever discourage anybody from praying. I want to discourage people from interpreting their prayers as if they're forcing their will upon whatever God is. And I think that's where it falls apart, and that's where your question falls into that same category. But thank you for it. I hope it started our thinking. A lady.
Thank you. I hope I can articulate this
Hold it
question.
Closer.
Okay, there.
Yeah.
For those of us who cannot believe the magical stories, the paranormal stories, what is left of this historical person called Jesus that lived 2,000 years ago and was apparently so phenomenal that all these millennia later, millions of people are either worshiping him or trying to follow him or both? What was his gift?
It's a good question. I'm going to try to address it tomorrow during the sermon. It really is the sort of the climax story, and I think you have to address it. Let me say just one thing that builds on something that Roger said during his time on the liturgy. He suggested that go forth and serve the Lord. They had dropped the Lord, and now it's just go forth and serve. Nothing wrong with that, but let me try to rescue the word Lord, that you need to know where it comes from. The word Messiah comes into the Jewish tradition originally as the name of the king. And it means simply the anointed one. That's all it means, anointed with oil. And if you read the Old Testament story, you'll know that the first king of Israel was anointed with oil by the prophet Samuel, and he became the king. You will also know that David, the shepherd boy, was anointed with oil by the prophet Samuel, and he became the second king. The Hebrew word was Mashiach, and it simply meant anointed with oil. It was a title for the king. And the king was frequently called the Son of God because he was the individual face of the nation, and the nation were the children of God. So the king became the direct son of God. Didn't quite get into emperor worship like with Hirohito during World War II, but it's clear that that was a tradition that God chose the king and then the people. It's sort of a hierarchical view. As long as the Jews had a king, then the word Messiah was kept in bounds. But in 598, the Babylonians rolled out of the north country and swept down on Jerusalem, besieged the city. In 596, they conquered the city. 10 years later, there was another rebellion, and the Babylonian army came back, and they reconquered the city. And they took the last king in the line of David. His name was Zedaliah. And they set him up on a stage, and they brought anybody who had any possible link to Zedaliah as the descendant and therefore the next king, and they murdered him. Didn't worry about women in those days. They murdered all the heirs to the throne that they could round up while Zedaliah watched. And then when they had killed them all, they put Zedaliah's eyes out and hauled him off to Babylon, and he died a blind man in a prison. You can read that story in the last chapters of 2 Kings. And the Davidic line was over. Now, there might still be some people around that claim that they are the direct descendant, as Joseph was said to be in the first century. But for all practical political purposes, the royal house of David was over. And so Messiah was cut loose from the king and began to float freely in Jewish mythology. And that's when all the images of Messiah began to develop. Some were very royal images. Messiah was a military figure on a white horse who would come down and defeat all Israel's enemies and reestablish the Jews as the conquering people of the world. They're very satisfying. But they also had some images that developed in that period of time that were quite unique. Isaiah 40 through 55 developed the image of Messiah as the suffering servant, the one who absorbed all of the anger and hostility of the people, draining the people of that anger and transforming it and giving it back as love. That was a messianic idea. Zechariah 9 through 14, developed an interesting image of Messiah as the shepherd king. And when you read that story, you discover that he is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver to those who buy and sell animals in the temple. And you begin to see how these stories began to shape how Jesus is remembered. Zechariah 14 closes by saying, "And when the day of the Lord comes, there will no longer be a traitor, Trader, in the house of the Lord." The story of Jesus cleansing the temple of all the traitors may well root in that passage from Zechariah, 2nd Zechariah, because chapters 9 through 14 are written about 100 years after chapters 1 through 8. But there were a wide variety. By the time you get to Daniel, the Messiah becomes somebody who is at the throne of the Ancient of Days and shares in the divinity of the Ancient of Days. So these images just grew all over the lot, because if you don't attach a concept to a concrete person, fantasies can run abroad. My favorite story about my favorite politician of the 20th century, Harry Truman, from Missouri, I might add. But Harry Truman was approached by the press one time when his popularity ratings were down about 22%, the lowest of almost any president we've ever had. And the press said to President Truman, "Mr. President, aren't you concerned that your popularity ratings are so low?" And Harry, in his typical manner, said, "Nope, not concerned at all." He said, "They're comparing me now with the ideal Republican." And he said, "There's no such thing as an ideal Republican. And when the day comes that they nominate a real Republican to run against me, then my ratings will go up and his will come down." That's true. As long as there was a real king, fantasy didn't come into the concept of Messiah. But when there wasn't a king, fantasies roamed all over the place. And the idea that a Messiah would come and reestablish the glory of Israel, and that he would be a descendant of King David, all of these things are in the tradition. And when the early Christian community identified Jesus with the concept of Messiah, that's when the first creed of the Christian church was adopted. It was 3 words. I think it's still the best creed we've ever had. Jesus is Messiah. What did it mean? It means that Jesus is the one in whom we see the will of God being lived out, the one through whom we hear the word of God being spoken. That's what Messiah had come to in the exile. They even called Cyrus, the king of the Persians, the Messiah, God's anointed one, God's Christ, because they saw the will of God being worked out through Cyrus. So anyone in whom the will of God is worked out, anyone through whom the word of God is heard, became Messiah. So the affirmation of the Christian church was Jesus is Messiah. Jesus is the life through which we hear the word of God speaking, the life in whom we see the word of God being lived out. Christianity did not remain a Jewish religion. And when it moved into the Greek world had no earthly concept what Messiah meant. So the Christian creed, Jesus is Messiah, just was nonsense. So they changed Messiah, Mashiach, and they translated that with the word kurios, from which we get Kyrie, and it meant Lord. And immediately it entered into a Greek world of supernatural beings. That's not what it was in the Hebrew world. And so to say, go out and serve the Lord, is go out and live your life as one in whom the word of God is spoken and in whom the will of God is seen being lived out. It doesn't mean what the word Lord came to mean. But when we translated it as Jesus is Lord, then in the Greek world they had to translate Lord. And that's when this concept of being the second person of the Trinity begins to develop. And when incarnation is a doctrine, because they had to figure out how God, who lived above the sky, got down into Jesus, because that was their experience. And so I think we can take some of these words that I think have been so badly misused and redeem them, but maybe not. Maybe it's too late. Maybe we'll never change that concept and that understanding. But I think that's a possibility. And so the concept of being the Messiah is one that everybody in here can share in, to the degree that you and I can be lives through which God's word is heard speaking, lives in whom God's will is seen being lived. You and I share in the Messiah, and we define ourselves against the way we have defined Jesus of Nazareth, about whom I hope I'll speak tomorrow in sufficient fashion for you to understand why they chose him for that. So let me thank you for letting me digress into all sorts of stuff that you didn't really ask. Yes. My wife says it's 4 o'clock. I listen to God and my wife. Not necessarily in that order. But I adore her. I want to tell you, I adore her. So let's stop for the evening, and we'll have one more session tomorrow. And thank you for your attention.
Let's everyone, yeah.
have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.